He had ordered the deaths of 17 men. He had judges on speed dial, police captains at his dinner table, and an entire city that looked the other way when his name came up. Han Suhan was not a man you helped. He was a man you avoided, a man you feared, a man you crossed the street to get away from, if you were smart enough to recognize him. But on a Tuesday night in October, in a back alley off Yulgiaro that smelled like rain and rust and exhaust, the most dangerous man in Seoul was bleeding out behind a dumpster. Alone, his phone in pieces, his men nowhere, and not one single person in that city was coming for him. Not one, except her. Celeste had worked a 16-hour shift. Her feet hurt. Her coat was thin. She had taken that alley because it cut 4 minutes off her walk home. 4 minutes. That's all it was. She had every reason to keep walking. Every logical, rational, self-preserving reason in the world to step around him and disappear into the night. So why didn't she? That question, that one quiet question, is what unravels everything that comes after. Her name is Celeste Okafor, 37 years old, originally from Lagos, trained as a clinical nurse for 11 years before an international recruitment agency promised her a contract in Seoul. Better pay, better conditions, a shot at something new. She landed at Incheon Airport on a Wednesday morning in March with 2 suitcases, a folder of credentials, and a confirmed placement. By Friday, the agency had dissolved. The contract was void. The money she'd spent to get there gone. She had enough in her account to fly home. She didn't. People who knew Celeste understood one thing about her above everything else. She did not retreat. Not from difficulty. Not from embarrassment. Not from a city that had already decided it had no place for her. She found a room in Dongdaemun. She found a job at a small private clinic in Jongnyo. Not the position she trained for, not the salary she deserved, but work. Real work. She took it without complaint. But survival in a city that cannot see you carries its own particular weight. Celeste had built her life here out of pure discipline. Out of the refusal to fall apart. Out of something deep and unshakable that most people never have to call on. And she called on it every single day. She was not looking for trouble. She was not looking for anything, except to get through the week. But the night she took that shortcut home, the night she chose that alley off Yulgiaro, something shifted. Not for Han Suhan. For her. She almost walked past him. That is the part that matters. That is the part she would think about later in the quiet moments. How close she came to simply stepping around him and going home. He was slumped against the wall behind the dumpster, half hidden by shadow and the angle of the alley. Her first thought was what anyone's first thought would be, drunk. Passed out. Not her business. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the suit. You don't sleep in an alley in a suit that costs more than someone's monthly rent. Maybe it was the stillness. The wrong kind of stillness, not the loose, heavy stillness of sleep, but something tighter. Collapsed. She took 2 steps closer. And then she saw the blood. Not a small amount. Not a graze. The kind of blood that tells you immediately, before your brain has finished the sentence, that something has gone very wrong, and very recently. Celeste did not scream. She did not freeze. 11 years of clinical training does not disappear because you are standing in an alley at midnight. Her hands were on him before the fear had time to form a complete thought. Pulse weak. Faint. But there. She called emergency services. The operator told her 12 minutes. She looked down at the man in front of her and understood, with the clarity that only real medical experience gives you, that 12 minutes was a negotiation she was going to have to win for him herself. And then she looked at him, really looked. The watch on his wrist was a Patek Philippe. The jacket, even torn and blood-soaked, was bespoke. His hands, the hands of a man who had not done manual labor in a long time. 3 bullet wounds. Chest and shoulder. Close range. Controlled. She didn't know it then, had no way of knowing. But the man bleeding out in front of her had grown up in Incheon, in a family that had once been comfortable and then, when he was 14, was not. His father's business had collapsed under years of accumulated debt. The kind of collapse that doesn't just take money. It takes everything. The house. The reputation. The family itself. He had watched it all happen and made a decision that 14-year-olds should never have to make. He had decided he would never be powerless again. She didn't know any of that. She just knew he was going to die if she stopped pressing. This was not a robbery. This was not random. This man had been taken somewhere quiet and shot with intent, and whoever had done it had left him here expecting the alley to finish the job. Everything in Celeste's life experience told her this was not her problem. Every instinct developed from 3 years of navigating a city that had given her nothing. Every lesson about keeping her head down, staying invisible, not getting involved in things that had nothing to do with her, all of it pointed in one direction. Walk away. She stayed. She pressed her hands against the worst of the wounds, and she talked to him. Firmly. Steadily. The way you talk to someone you are refusing to lose. Stay with me. You hear me? Stay with me. Help is coming. You do not get to close your eyes right now. At some point, she cannot say exactly when, he opened his eyes. And he looked at her. Not with confusion. Not with the glazed, unfocused look of a man fading out. He looked at her with something sharp underneath the pain. Something that was trying to understand what it was seeing. A stranger. In a dark alley. Keeping him alive with her bare hands. For a man like Han Suhan, that was something he had no category for. She didn't know his name yet. But his name was about to change everything about her life. In 46 years, Han Suhan had never once been in a position where he needed something from someone who had no reason to give it. He had never been vulnerable. Not once. Not until that alley. The ambulance arrived at minute 12. Celeste rode with him because there was no one else. His men had not yet found him, and she was not willing to hand an unconscious man to paramedics and simply walk away. That was not who she was. At the hospital, they had been inside for less than 4 minutes when the men appeared. 3 of them. Dark coats. The kind of stillness that is trained, not natural. They moved through that corridor like they already owned it, because in every way that mattered they did. One of them reached her. His hand closed around her arm. Not violently, but with the particular firmness of someone who is accustomed to not being refused. Who are you? What did you see? Celeste looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at him. 11 years as a nurse. 3 years surviving alone in a city that gave her nothing. A 16-hour shift. Blood still on her coat. She was tired. She was shaken. I'm the reason he's still breathing, she said. That's all you need to know. The man held her gaze for a long moment. Then he let go. What Celeste did not know, could not have known, was that those men reported everything back. Every detail. What she said. How she said it. The fact that she had stayed. The fact that she had not asked a single question about who he was, or what it meant that 3 men in expensive coats had materialized in an emergency ward within minutes of their arrival. She had not flinched. In Han Suhan's world, everyone flinched eventually. It was only a matter of finding the right pressure point. She didn't realize it then, but she had just passed a test she didn't know she was taking. Han Suhan was unconscious for 31 hours. When he woke, his first words were about who had done it. That was expected. Yu Taesung had the information ready. They spoke for 6 minutes about the faction, the approach, the failure of his own security. Han listened, asked 2 questions, then went quiet in the particular way that meant the matter was already decided and would be handled. Then he said, "The woman in the alley. Where is she?" Yu Taesung, who had been with Han for 16 years and understood him better than almost anyone alive, gave him the answer and then waited. Han had built the Gyoko Syndicate from a street-level operation into one of the most quietly powerful criminal organizations in South Korea. Not the loudest, not the most visible, the most durable. He had judges. He had police captains. His enemies feared his silence more than his words, because when Han Suhan went quiet, something had already been decided. His own men feared his patience. He never reacted immediately. He waited, and when he moved, it was with a precision that left no room for appeal. Taesung knew all of this, had watched all of it, which was why when Han asked about the woman after the men who had shot him, he said nothing and simply waited. Because Yu Taesung already knew what came next, and he had already prepared his argument. The argument was simple, logical, irrefutable by any standard that had ever governed how the Gyoko Syndicate operated. She was a loose end. She had seen Han's face in a compromised state. She had been present at the hospital. She had spoken to his men. She was a foreign national with no ties to the organization, no leverage, no reason to stay quiet, and no understanding of what staying quiet actually meant in this context. In 16 years, Yu Taesung had never had to make this particular recommendation more than once. Han looked at him and said no. Not with anger. Not with hesitation. Just no. Flat and final, the way he ended conversations that were no longer worth having. Yu Taesung did not push. He had learned, over 16 years, exactly where that line was. 3 days after Han was discharged, an envelope was delivered to Celeste's building. Left with her landlord. No name on it from the outside. Inside, 3 months' rent in cash. No note. No explanation. She knew immediately. She didn't open it for 2 hours. She sat with it on her small table and thought about what it meant. What accepting it would mean. What it would cost her, not financially. The other kind of cost. The kind you pay with the part of yourself that knows who you are. She put the full envelope back inside a plain envelope of her own. Sealed it. Wrote nothing on it. And sent it back through the same landlord it had come from. When Yu Taesung placed that returned envelope on the table in front of Han Soo-han and told him what had happened, Han said nothing. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Yu Taesung began to wonder if he should leave the room. Then, quietly, almost to himself, in the way of a man thinking out loud rather than giving an order. Find out what she needs. Not what she wants. Not what she can be offered. What she needs. In 32 years of operating in a world where every transaction had a price and every person had a number, Han Soo-han had never once had his money returned. Not from an enemy. Not from an ally. Not from anyone. Money in his world was the clearest language there was. It communicated gratitude, threat, ownership, and obligation all at once. Everyone understood it. Everyone responded to it. Celeste had picked it up, looked at it, and handed it back. Without a word, without a scene, without asking for anything in return, she had told him exactly who she was. She was not for sale. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that everything and everyone ultimately was, that was a language he didn't have a response to. Would you have returned that envelope? Drop your answer below. 3 weeks after she returned that envelope, Celeste's life began to come apart. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way things usually fall apart for people who are already stretched thin, quietly, and from multiple directions simultaneously. First, the landlord. The building had been sold to a property development group. The tenants had 2 weeks to vacate. It was legal. It was documented. And it was for Celeste a problem with no immediate solution, because 2 weeks was not enough time to find affordable housing in that part of Seoul, and she had already looked. Then the clinic. Budget restructuring, the administrator said. Her hours were being reduced. Not eliminated, reduced. Which was almost worse because it meant she couldn't even begin looking for a replacement position without explanation. This was not the first time the city had moved against her without warning. Her landlord had raised the rent twice in the 18 months before the building sold. Both times, no notice, both times she paid it. Her co-workers at the clinic were not cruel. They were simply indifferent. Conversations happened around her. Decisions were made without her. She was competent enough to rely on and invisible enough to overlook. She had survived all of it by staying steady. This was more of the same, except the list of options was shorter than it had ever been. She did not argue. She did not break down. She sat with both pieces of information, the way she sat with most difficult things, steadily, without performance, and she started making a list of what her options actually were. The list was short. And then the strange things began. The eviction notice was rescinded. Not delayed, rescinded. The property development deal, which had been finalized and signed, collapsed overnight. No public explanation. No statement from the developer. It simply ceased to exist as a transaction. 2 days later, the clinic received notification of a new medical grant. Anonymous donor. Substantial. Enough to restore the cut hours and fund an expansion of the outpatient program Celeste had been quietly running understaffed for 8 months. She sat with that information for exactly 1 evening. Then she started making inquiries. This is the part that Yu Taesung would later describe, to the very small number of people he trusted enough to describe anything to, as the moment he understood that Celeste Okafor was not an ordinary person. The grant documentation had come through the clinic's administrator. Clean, official, untraceable at first glance. But Celeste had spent 3 years in Seoul learning to read what paperwork was trying not to say. The holding company name on the grant meant nothing on its own. The registered address attached to it meant something. She pulled the thread, because the address she arrived at 3 days later was not public. It was not registered. It existed in no directory that a civilian should have had access to. The building was clean, corporate-facing, entirely unremarkable from the outside, and it was one of the Gyoko Syndicate's primary legitimate operations fronts. She walked in and asked for Han Suhan by name. The man at the front desk, trained, composed, experienced in turning people away without incident, looked at her for a moment and then inexplicably made a phone call. Han Suhan took the call, and he said, "Send her up." She walked into his office the way she had walked into that alley, without performance, without fear. She stood across the desk from him and she said, "I didn't ask for this." He looked at her. The full, unhurried attention of a man who was accustomed to reading people quickly and reading them accurately. Then he said, "I know. That's why you got it." She held his gaze. She was deciding something. It was visible in the way she held herself, the slight pause before she answered. She was measuring him. Not his power. Not his reputation. Him. "Don't do it again," she said. "That's not a promise I can make," he said. She left. Han Suhan sat in that office for a long time after she walked out. Long enough that Yu Tae-sung, who had been at the edge of the room, came in to check that everything was in order. Han was looking at the door she had just walked through. He said nothing. For a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling every variable in every room he occupied, every outcome, every allegiance, every pressure point, Celeste was something he had not encountered before. Not because she was fearless. He had met fearless people. Fearless people were usually reckless, and reckless people were manageable. She wasn't reckless. She was clear. There is a difference, and it is a significant one. She had walked into his world, looked at everything it represented, and remained entirely, immovably herself. That was not a variable he had a framework for. And that, quietly, and with a weight he hadn't felt in a very long time, was beginning to matter to him in ways he had not given himself permission to examine. Not yet. In Han Suhan's world, attention was currency. And the moment you directed your attention somewhere consistently, toward a person, a place, a pattern of behavior, the people watching you noticed. Because in that world, everyone was always watching. That was how you survived. That was how you stayed ahead. His rivals had been watching Han for years. They knew his schedule, his habits, his lieutenants, his properties. They knew the contours of his operation the way you know the layout of a room you've been circling for a long time without entering. What they had never seen, not once in all those years, was Han Suhan move to protect someone who had no formal connection to the Gyoko Syndicate. No title. No contract. No leverage. Just a woman who lived in Dongdaemun and worked 2 jobs and had, apparently, done something that caused one of the most guarded men in South Korea to quietly dismantle a property deal and fund a medical clinic. They had someone inside the city planning office. The collapsed property deal had passed across that desk. They had someone watching the clinic grant registry. They had been building a file for 2 weeks before they moved. That was new. And new in their world meant exploitable. The warning came on a Thursday night. Celeste returned to her room to find the window facing the alley broken from the outside. Clean break. Deliberate. On the floor beneath it, a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in Korean. 3 years in Seoul had given her enough Korean to read it without help. She understood the shape of a threat. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call, not for this. She sat down at her small table in her coat because the room was cold with the window broken, and she held the piece of paper and she let herself feel it. Not the fear of it, she had made peace with fear a long time ago, but the particular weight of being alone in a room with a broken window in a city that had never formally acknowledged she existed. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of paying rent, sending money home, working double shifts, staying invisible. And still somehow she had ended up here, holding a threat that wasn't even meant for her. That had arrived because she had done what any decent person would have done in that alley. And that, apparently, was enough to make her a target. She set the paper down. She stood up. She found a piece of cardboard in her kitchen and covered the window as best she could. Then she put the kettle on. Because there was nothing else to do tonight. And tomorrow she would decide. What happened in the 48 hours that followed was not something that made the news. It was not something that was discussed openly, even within the Gyoko organization. But the faction that had sent that message, a mid-level rival group that had been testing Han's boundaries for months, went very quiet very suddenly. Not because they were asked to. Because Han Suhan's response was swift and cold and total. Disproportionate by any conventional calculation. The kind of response that doesn't just answer a threat, it erases the question entirely. Yu Taesung would later say that he had not seen Han move that fast, or that hard, over anything personal in 16 years. That word, personal, was the problem. Celeste knew. She had not been told. She did not need to be. She had spent 3 years reading a city that communicated mostly in silence, and she was very good at understanding what silence meant. She went to him. She did not call ahead. She walked into that building, and she stood in front of his desk and she said, "You're making me a target by protecting me. Do you understand that?" Han looked at her. He did not deny it. He did not reach for a justification. He said, "Then stay closer." The room was very quiet. "That's not a solution," she said. "That's you refusing to let go." And Han Suhan, a man who had not been without an answer in 32 years. A man who had faced down prosecutors, rivals, betrayals, and losses that would have destroyed most people. A man who had built an empire on the foundation of never being caught without a move. Said nothing. Because she was right, and he knew it, and he had no argument that wasn't really just, he didn't want to. He didn't want to pull back. He didn't want to recalibrate. He didn't want to do the cold, logical thing that 32 years of survival told him was the only sensible option. That realization sat in the room between them like something physical. Han Suhan had spent his entire life as the most dangerous man in any room he entered. People arranged themselves around his presence. They adjusted their behavior, their language, their posture. They made themselves smaller. Celeste looked at him the way she had looked at him in that alley, like he was simply a man, complicated and guarded, and carrying more than he would ever say out loud, but a man. No more, no less. He did not know what to do with that. He had never had to. She left without waiting for an answer he wasn't able to give. And Yu Taesung, who had heard everything from the corridor, stood very still for a long moment after the front door closed. Because in 16 years he had never seen Han Suhan lose a conversation. She came back 2 days later. Not because he had asked her to. Not because she had softened on anything she had said. She came back because she had decided something, alone in her room, and she needed to say it to his face. She stood across the desk from him. The same desk, the same room, the same man who still had not found an answer, and she said, "I'm not asking you to stop protecting me. I'm asking you to understand what you're asking me to become by accepting it." Han was quiet for a long moment. "What are you afraid of becoming?" he said. "Someone who stops noticing what it costs," she said. He looked at her. That full, unhurried attention. And for once she let him look. "Then keep noticing," he said. "I won't ask you to stop." It was not a resolution. It was not a promise that everything that came with him would be clean or uncomplicated or without cost. They both understood that. But it was the first honest thing either of them had said without a wall behind it. She knew what the dismantling of that faction had meant. She had not asked. She had not needed to. She was a woman who paid attention, and she had paid attention to the quality of Han's silence in the days after she brought him the billing records. The particular stillness of a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. She understood, without being told, what executing it looked like in his world. She had made her peace with that understanding alone, in her room, over several nights. Not easily. Not without cost. But she had made it. Because the alternative, to refuse what he had built for her on the grounds that his hands were not clean, would have required her to pretend that the world was simpler than it was. And Celeste Okafor had never been able to afford that pretense. She left. And this time, she did not leave because she was out of words. She left because she had said the one that mattered. It started with a pattern she wasn't looking for. That is the thing about Celeste Okafor. She paid attention. Not selectively. Not only to the things that concerned her directly. She paid attention the way people do when they have spent years being the only person in a room who couldn't afford to miss anything. The clinic had expanded since the anonymous grant. More patients. More intake. More paperwork moving through her hands on a daily basis. She had found a second job within her first month in Seoul, a convenience store 3 blocks from her room, evening shifts, weekends. Every month, before a single bill of her own was paid, she sent money home. Her brother still thought she was doing well. She had always made sure of it. She was doing better now. That was something. And somewhere in the 3rd week of the new patient logs, something caught her eye. Not a name. Not a face. A pattern. A cluster of patients presenting with minor injuries. The kind that don't require emergency care but do require documentation. Arriving in a specific sequence from specific districts on specific days. The billing codes were clean. The paperwork was immaculate. Too immaculate. The kind of clean that takes effort. The kind of effort that means someone somewhere needed these records to exist and to be unquestioned. She had seen billing irregularities before. Not on this scale, but she recognized the shape of them. When she had first arrived in Seoul, the agency that recruited her had dissolved overnight and left no honest paper trail. She had spent 2 weeks then trying to understand where the money had gone and why the documentation didn't match. She had learned in that process how clean fraudulent paperwork tried to look. And she had learned that the cleaner it looked, the harder someone had worked to make it that way. What she had was 11 years of watching how systems worked. She sat with it for 4 days, cross-referenced what she could, built a timeline on paper at her kitchen table after her shifts. And then she went to Han. She laid it out in front of him, methodically, without drama. The dates, the districts, the billing sequence, the gaps that didn't add up. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "How did you?" "I pay attention," she said. "It's what I do." What Celeste had found, without knowing the full architecture of what she was looking at, was the financial thread connecting the faction that had ordered the hit on Han to a laundering operation that had been running, carefully and quietly, for almost 2 years. It was the kind of evidence that, in the right hands, could unravel an entire network. Han Soo-han knew exactly what to do with it. What followed was not clean, and it was not gentle, and it was not the kind of thing that ever appeared in any record that would survive. What matters is the result. The faction was dismantled. The men who had sent that note, who had broken Celeste's window on a Thursday night and written 4 words they believed would be enough to move her, were gone. The threat against her was not neutralized. It was removed. Completely. Permanently. And then something shifted. Not in the city. Not in the organization. In Han Soo-han himself. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens in people who have been still for a very long time and then, quietly, begin to move in a different direction. Yu Taesung noticed it first in small things. Han began arriving at the office later than usual. Not by much, but enough that Taesung checked his phone twice the first morning it happened. He caught Han standing at the window during a call he would normally have paced through. Once, and only once, he came in to find Han looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man doing mental arithmetic about something that had no numbers. Taesung said nothing. In 16 years, he had learned that the most important things Han worked through, he worked through alone. But he noted it. He noted all of it. Because this was not a man recalibrating strategy. This was a man reconsidering something more fundamental than that. 3 months after the faction was dismantled, a legitimate medical foundation was registered in Seoul. Properly documented. Legally structured. Funded by a source that, if you traced it carefully, connected back to a holding company with no visible ties to anything that would raise concern. The foundation's inaugural program was a community health initiative, outpatient care, preventive services, staffed by qualified clinicians, operating out of a building in Jongno that had been quietly renovated over 6 weeks. The director's name, on the official documentation, was Celeste Okafor. No conditions attached. No debt implied. No expectation of return. She went to him when she found out. She did not go in anger this time. She went with the particular stillness of someone who needs to understand something before they can accept it. She asked him why. Han Soo-han was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that in another person might seem like avoidance. But in him, she had learned, meant that he was choosing his words with unusual care. Then he said, "You didn't save me because you knew who I was. You saved me because of who you are." He paused. "That deserves to exist in this world." Loudly. She didn't respond immediately. There was nothing to argue with. There was nothing to return this time. She simply looked at him, the way she always looked at him. Like he was a man, with everything that word contains. The damage and the capacity. The hardness, and the thing underneath the hardness that had been waiting, without his permission, for someone to see it without flinching. Celeste Okafor did not come to Seoul to change anyone's life. She came to survive, to send money home, to keep her head down in a city that had not made space for her, and build something small and stable out of whatever was available. She had not been looking for Han Soo-han. She had not been looking for any of this. But there is a particular kind of danger that no one warns you about, the danger of being completely, authentically yourself in front of someone who has never encountered that before. Because once a person like Han Soo-han sees genuine humanity, unperformed, unstrategic, offered without calculation, they do not forget it. They do not let it go. The clinic opened on a Wednesday morning in April. It was full by midday. Celeste's name was on the door. Somewhere across the city, in an office on a high floor with a view of a Seoul that was already moving into spring, Han Soo-han stood at a window. He was not reviewing reports. He was not taking calls. He was not calculating the next move in a game that had occupied every hour of his adult life. He was standing at a window, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he did not look like a man waiting for the next threat to arrive. He looked like a man with something worth protecting. And for Han Soo-han, that was everything. She stood outside for a moment before she went in. Not from hesitation, she had not come this far by hesitating, but because there are things you have to look at before you can move through them. Her name, on a door, in a city that had spent 3 years looking straight through her. She thought about the room in Dongdaemun, the 2 suitcases, the folder of credentials that had meant nothing to anyone who mattered. She thought about every month she had sent money home and told her brother things were fine. They were fine now. Not the way she had planned. Not the way she had imagined it when she landed at Incheon with everything she owned and a confirmed placement that dissolved by Friday. Something stranger than that. Something she had not been looking for and could not have designed. She pushed the door open and went in. That was enough. That was, she thought, more than enough.